Hello, folks. Let's talk about fats today. So, what do you think of when we say the word fats? Do you instinctively find yourself looking at your waistline, or your legs, or your arms? Or do you think about the dessert you avoided, or the dessert you did consume and are now feeling guilty? Fats are probably the new abusive word in our present day parlance, unfortunately, and possibly again one of the most misunderstood of assets to the human body. Why am I saying assets? Well, fats as an organ system, and I've addressed this in a previous podcast, is basically a luxury provided to us as a species to survive in low energy, low food conditions. What does that really mean? Well, it means that as a species, when we come across more food than we need for our current energy needs, we can put the additional energy away, the additional food away in the form of inert, healthy fats, which are very rich in energies, very easy to store, physiologically very good for storage purposes, and consume them or bring them out when we finally need them in circumstances when availability to food is low. Now you can imagine in evolutionary history where we didn't always have access to food on a consistent basis. This was an asset. It's also why humans, amongst some of the other animals, have managed to survive and thrive as we have. Interestingly, a lot of people don't know that a number of the great apes don't actually carry very much fat. In fact, I think monkeys, I believe, don't carry fat. And interestingly, you'll find that they have low buoyancy as a result of it. So not only do fats save you in low energy conditions, fats in your body is what allows you to float. Also, fats is what allow us to maintain body temperature in freezing cold weathers. So if you're dealing with minus 11 degrees Celsius outside, which occasionally here in Columbus we are, fats in the body are burnt up by the muscles, and muscles also shiver in this case, to provide us the immediate boost of energy to heat up the body. So, not always all bad. Fats are really, really important. Now, if you look at it from the point of view of the macromolecule or the nutrient, fats are still extremely important. You might wonder why. But firstly, fats, cholesterols play an extremely important role in lubricating the different organ systems. They provide a lot of lubrication and a lot of the important constituents that we need essentially around our different organ systems, including joints especially, and they play a very important role in the integrity of individual cells in the body. So the cells that we all possess in counts of millions have something called a cell membrane on their outside, which holds the entire content of the cell together, basically like a wall around it. But the wall isn't completely stiff, and this is what fats really do. They help make the walls a lot more permeable, a lot more malleable in a way, and they give it all the beautiful physiological features that we really need for cells to survive and to recycle. And most cells in our body are recycled on the basis of weekly, monthly, some over longer spans of time. In the absence of cholesterols and the complete absence of fats, this would not be possible. Cells would never regrow, which means that an organism would never be able to replace old dead cells, which would then mean not the best of health conditions, right? So as a nutrient, very important. Another way that fats are really important as nutrients is that they are the number one energy providers to your brain, essentially. So 60% of the brain's energy actually comes from fats, not glucose. But then you might ask, what is this whole crusade against fats? Why are we always blaming the fats? Well, fats, and particularly the feature of being overweight, has repeatedly been linked with conditions like diabetes, like metabolic syndrome, polycystic ovarian syndrome. Presently, also a lot of studies focusing on breast cancer indicate that being overweight does have an impact on such conditions as breast cancer and how aggressive the disease and its output might be. So how is it that something that can be so important physiologically and so good for the body can simultaneously also be extremely damaging for the body? Well, this is where it becomes important to understand fats from the point of view of its compartments. There's such a thing as metrics around body weight and understanding um, the concept of fats around the whole body. And these metrics are based on the way fats are distributed around the human body. The number one metric that most of us have come across that are traditionally used in most large population studies are the so-called body mass index method. So this is really based on an assessment or a ratio of your weight in kilograms to your height in meters square. This ratio, if it's between 18 and 25, indicates that you are normal weight. If the ratio is under 18, then you're underweight. If the ratio is between 25 and 30, you're overweight, and 30 upwards, you're looking at individuals with obesity. The trouble with BMI, though, is that it focuses on the distribution of your weight across your height. It doesn't take into consideration the muscle mass you might carry, any other form of lean mass you may or may not have, any extremes of size, either in terms of height or in terms of structure. And for the most part, it's a pretty reasonable estimate, but not always 100% accurate for the extreme conditions of somebody who's maybe extremely short, or say a bodybuilder could easily come across as overweight based on the BMI ratio, when actually they're carrying their body weight and even their fats possibly quite well. So that's one factor. Another factor we look into usually is the bioimpedance, which is a metric that a number of gyms will usually use. What this depends on is passing a very short, very low current through the body and looking at its conductivity through the body. What that does is the higher the body fat content, the more resistance there is to the passing of this current. And it becomes a surrogate measure of sorts to how much body fat there exists. Now, the trouble with this is that it's highly variable depending on the time of the day, your hydration levels, and a number of other factors. So, again, not an ideal measure. In comparison, some individuals, though, will tend to use something that's a little bit more mechanical. It's called a caliper, which really is like a prong that holds onto different folds of the skin, where skin's loose, basically. So usually around the abdomen, on the thigh, on the arms. Wherever we find extra loose skin that comes off away from the core body, it's pinched by this thing called the caliper, and the measure is noted to be plugged into an equation to get an estimate of the overall body fat percentage. And now this is traditionally used by a number of athletes, actually. Of course, there's far more sensitive methods now that are possibly even slightly invasive, but this used to be used, let's say, for a long period of time. And while it is a pretty good method, the issue is that you need it done by somebody who really understands the technique properly, and again, it lends itself to a lot of errors depending on the user. But if we want to address fats from the point of view of health and health maintenance, another measure which makes a lot more sense, which is now applied across the board in a number of population studies, is the so-called waist to hip ratio. And this ratio allows us to break down just how much fat we carry in the abdomen versus other parts of the body, particularly the hip area. The ratio, obviously, as the name indicates, is the ratio of the circumference of your waist to the circumference of your hip. And if this is upwards of 0.85 in women, usually it's seen as unhealthy, and upwards of 0.9 in men is seen as unhealthy as well. Again, it's possibly an extremely misleading ratio if you look at women or men even with an uneven distribution of fats, where they preferentially store more fats in their lower half of the body or in the hip area compared to the waistline. But the upside of this particular ratio is that possibly the biggest contributor to physiological issues or to health issues traditionally tends to be fat stored in the waistline or near the waistline as opposed to the hips. So fats that people store on their thighs or in their hips, even though, again, I think socially it's not seen as desirable, is on the healthier side compared to fat stored in the abdomen. Which brings me to this concept of the so-called inert fat and the metabolically unhealthy fat. So there's individuals in the world who can exist or can be extremely overweight, but not be unhealthy, metabolically speaking, who may not experience insulin resistance, who may not have any kind of concern around diabetes. And then there's individuals who, in comparison, may not be as large, shall we say, may not carry as much body mass, but are unfit and unhealthy and are at much higher risks of metabolic conditions and diabetes and breast cancer and what have you. Now, why is that the case? Now, this comes down to evolution greatly, and to a great extent depends on how we handle our fats. And that is very individual for different people. It depends largely on your ethnicity, oddly enough, actually, and also on your personal genetics coming from your family, your parents. So how does ethnicity feed into obesity and fats-related issues? Well, in certain populations that traditionally evolved closer to the equator, like the Southeast Asian population, including India and the Indian subcontinent, individuals are usually very lean, but will occasionally just show more preferential fat storage around their abdomen. And this is really where the issues come up. There's a very specific phenotype that we refer to as the thin fat, which actually was coined in the context of Indians, the thin fat Indian, which really indicates that it's the mishandling of fats and lipids and cholesterols, which lends to disease as opposed to always becoming considerably bigger. And this is really an interesting point of view, because individuals in this belt of the world, the South Asian, the Indian subcontinent, even at much lower body weights and BMIs of 23, which is traditionally seen as normal body weight, can have more body fat percentage and be storing fats in places like the liver and in other organ systems where fats should not be stored, leading to disease, leading to insulin resistance, compared to individuals who are the same size, the same age, matched in every other way except for ethnicity, possibly Caucasian, who don't run the same risks. So this is really fascinating in some ways, that our lipid handling, our fat handling is highly dependent on where we've evolved as a species. And the way to, again, extrapolate from this is that when you see individuals who completely go on or go off a fat diet, decide never to eat fats again, vow off of them, often don't realize that fats are also coming from high carbs or high proteins. So if you take away fats from your diet, but all your energy needs are being met by carbohydrates, unless you're very precisely weighing out how much of your carbohydrates you're consuming and burning, the extra is still being converted into fats. And in, again, some very special populations, there's a very high preference towards skewing the curve, moving from carbohydrates straight to cholesterols. So this is, again, population where traditionally we see such things as high cholesterol issues in their blood, which is another metric of poor lipid-related outcomes. So some individuals just intrinsically or genetically or for whatever metabolic conditions they might have a tendency for producing more cholesterols and storing and running more cholesterols in the body and triglycerides as well. And in this case, the solution, instead of taking away fats from the diet, might actually be lowering the consumption of carbohydrates, especially at a time when they don't necessarily need very high energy. So in this case, it becomes a case of maybe avoiding grains at the nighttime before bed, or alternating a few things. In fact, there's a very interesting article that we've written about this in the blog, referring to the Paleo Diet. So we've jotted down some of the metrics around fats. We have an idea of why fats are important. We know that physiologically they play an important role, but they also contribute to a number of diseases. They contribute to inflammation and throwing off a lot of the body's physiological functions, while at the same time supporting certain others. So fats really still are an asset. However, depending on where they are in the body and depending on one's own genetic background, they can be either a good or a bad thing. The question is to best understand your phenotype, which is to say, to best understand your system and where fats are significant to you or not. Some ways of doing this is really worthwhile getting a blood test to see what your cholesterol levels look like at baseline. It's worthwhile doing some of the basic metrics I've mentioned earlier, the BMI, the waist to hip ratio, even body fat percentage if you can, and to essentially keep an eye on it as you do go about either wearing your lifestyle or just on a few months basis to see whether it changes with any amount of variation in your life. And eventually, it's also really important to consider that when you do consider things like a diet, anything that's extreme is going to be hard to sustain, but particularly importantly, anything in the lines of completely abolishing one whole macronutrient, especially something like fats, is not the best of ideas. As I mentioned earlier, fats are extremely important nutrients or energy sources for the brain, and they're very critically important for so many other factors like maintaining cell membrane integrity and the health of so many organ systems that you preferably don't want to jeopardize something of that nature. It's important to remember that fats are an extremely important tissue as well as an extremely important nutrient in the body. But understanding your specific relationship with fats is key to the puzzle that is maintaining both health and maybe an aesthetic output for yourself. I'd love to address this with anybody who wants to look at it on an individual basis. If you'd like to drop me an email, I can perhaps share more about the metrics with you. We have currently got a prediction calculator for diabetes and metabolic syndrome on the Typeform link that's provided down here as well. If you click on that link, and if you know a few of these measures of your body or your blood type already, then it can give you a pretty good indication of whether or not one has a risk of developing diabetes over the next 5 to 10 years span. So with that in mind, I hope you found this particular chat useful. If there's specific questions around fats, then I'd love to address them. And in the meantime, stay fit and stay healthy.